Hey there, everybody. We're going to get started today on learning the basics of setting keyframes. This is a very introductory lesson for anyone new to After Effects who's curious on how to set keyframes for different properties. So let's start by talking about what is a keyframe. A keyframe is essentially a time or point in space in which you register the position of the asset on your screen. So we can keyframe tons of different elements. We can keyframe position, we can keyframe scale, rotation, we can keyframe different effects. And essentially in After Effects, anything that has a stopwatch, which I'll show you in a few seconds next to it, we can keyframe. So let's go ahead and dive into that. Let me go ahead and open down this asset that I have currently on my stage. And you'll notice that we have all of these different stopwatch symbols next to these different attributes. So we have our anchor point, which is this small center aspect. Now this anchor point is going to be really important. Depending on where this anchor point is, that is where it is going to basically control where your position, scale, rotation, etc., the movement comes from. So for instance, if I scale, you'll notice it scales from that center point. How do I move this anchor point? Well, I could sit here and drag my left mouse button over these blue values, or what I could do is go up to the top of my screen and use my anchor point tool, which is Y on your keyboard. Once you do that, if you want to manipulate where you're going to move your keyframe, you can just simply move that anchor point, hit the V key to go back to your selection tool, and you'll notice if I move the scale again, it goes from the bottom. Now, if you're going to move your anchor point, I highly recommend that you do that at the beginning before you set any keyframes of your animation. And then a fun fact, we can go ahead and center this anchor point if we want as well. I'm going to use Control-Alt-Home on a PC. The Control-Alt-Home will center my anchor point back to where I need it to be. Now that I have that kind of set up, let's talk about what an actual keyframe is. So right now these values, and we'll just look at position to start, and I'm going to hit P on my keyboard to isolate position. We're going to see that it's 320 by 356. Well, what does this mean? Well, essentially, if we go ahead and turn on our grid here, and let's go ahead and turn this on, all of these are pixels. So this composition is 1920 by 1080, meaning the pixel here, if I move it to the very top of my screen, and we'll just move it to the very corner, that little anchor point, you'll notice it gets pretty close to 0. So if I were to type 0 here, that's 0, 0. And if I move this to the very bottom of my screen, you're going to find that that's that 1920 by 1080. So this is just a representation of the pixels and where this little dot or this anchor point is on the pixels of the screen. So if I were to move this into close to the dead center, you're going to get almost a half value of that 1920 or whatever your overall comp size is going to be. A lot of people don't realize that these are actually associated pixels and not just superfluous numbers. So now that we have kind of that aspect, let me go ahead and turn off my grid again. Let's go ahead and set a keyframe. To set a keyframe, you're going to want to make sure you understand what time frame that your cursor is on. So I'm going to move my cursor, in this case, to the 0-second mark, and I'm going to go ahead and hit the keyframe for position. Now what that does is gives me a diamond. This diamond is registering, in this case, 252 by 296 pixels, and it's going to register it at 0 seconds. That's where that diamond is always going to be. Now if I move forward a little bit on my timeline, and let's say we go up to roughly 2 seconds, I, by inclination, with the stopwatch, would want to start and stop. But if I click my stopwatch again, the keyframe goes away. So I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. You don't want to click your stopwatch again. At this point, once it's clicked and you're animating, you can go ahead and either drag the value of your keyframe, so we can manipulate that in the left or right or up and down X or Y values, or you can click on your asset with your left mouse button and move your keyframe. And by doing that, because the stopwatch is selected, you've automatically selected and set a second keyframe. So if I want to play this back, I'm going to hit the space bar, or I can change the shortcut up here depending if I have other hotkeys associated with that. But I can go ahead and hit the space bar and we can kind of watch this left to right movement. So this is pretty standard movement. Now let's say we want to add a scale keyframe. Well, the hotkeys for all of these things, S will be scale, R will be rotation, P will be position, and T will be opacity. Think of it like transparency. Those will activate those. If you want to add more values than just one, you would hold the Shift key. So if I hit Shift P, Shift R, and Shift S, I will add to my list. Another really easy way to do this in the updated 2023 version of After Effects is to go to something called the Properties panel. Now, the Properties panel is a really great way to kind of see all of those elements at once without having really to go ahead and do the drop down. So I can still set my keyframes in the Properties panel. For instance, if I want to set a keyframe for scale and then have this go kind of to that 2-second mark, right, somewhere over here, I could go ahead and then raise that keyframe, and now I'm going to get some scale happening. Now, what if you want to see the things that you've keyframed? Well, if I hit the U key, that's going to open everything U keyframed. So the hotkey U is going to be really helpful in this aspect too, because now I can actually set my keyframe positions to match exactly with the scale and the transform. So now they kind of scale at the appropriate time. So this is a really quick way to animate keyframes. Now, if I want to animate an effect, let's go ahead and add an effect to this. Let's do perhaps like a color correction, or we could kind of animate the hue and saturation of this, and we're going to do colorize. So you can see we can kind of play with this. I can see that I have the stopwatches next to these as well. So if I wanted to go ahead and set a stopwatch on the hue, move that over, and then maybe have that kind of change colors, that's going to also set a stopwatch. And again, if I hit U, that will pull that up within there. And you can see that now we have a fun color effect. If we don't like that color effect, again, we can just simply, in this case, just delete our effect, and we're good to go. So the importance of keyframes is the ability to kind of, again, set these diamonds. Now, these diamonds are really important. Let's say we want to move everything slower. Well, we can actually highlight our keyframes and drag them with our left mouse button, and things will move slower. Or if we want to speed these up, we can go ahead and pull them closer together, and you'll have a faster value. You can also offset your keyframes if you want a little bit of kind of offset to your animation. We also have the ability to switch our keyframes. If we want to kind of reverse our animation, we can just kind of drag them over one another to kind of do that switch. So setting these keyframes is really, really important to get you started in Adobe After Effects. Now, this is just the basics. We'll do another lesson on the graph editor and getting some more kind of sizzle and pizzazz out of your keyframes. But this is the basic way to use the Properties panel, or again, your drop down here of your assets to set your basic keyframes. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll catch you next time.